All right, without much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. You will receive a recording for this lecture, so if you have to pop out early, don't feel bad. You'll get a recording usually in about a day or two. I'll have an edited recording available for all of you. So let's get started. First off, thank you all so much for joining me as we talk about the history of Harbor Springs. I think that this presentation and part 2 of the presentation are just a great chance to learn sort of the basics about our history here in Harbor Springs. And then you can sort of dive deeper by coming to special exhibits or coming to our other lecture series. So thank you all so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And here we go. To get started, I did this lecture for a group that didn't know where Harbor Springs was fairly recently, so I had to place us here. And you can see everyone on the chat probably knows where we are. But this is where we're starting, kind of putting us in place and talking about Harbor Springs as a geological and natural feature. So talking a little bit about what makes Harbor Springs in a geological sense. We're going way back to our history. So our area was created through the movement of different glaciers. Most of the natural features that I'm going to talk about were from about 12,000 years ago, when a glacier called the Laurentide ice sheet receded out of our way. And as it receded, you can see in these images here, as it receded, it created something called moraines, which are these mixtures of sand and clay and rocks that are deposited by the melting ice. And these created some of the highest hills in our area, which the ski hills, Boyne Highland and Nubbs Knob, are on now. So that's what the moraines are and how they were created. Now, the bluff at the back of Harbor Springs was actually created by the shores of these sort of ancient lakes. There's a shoreline. Sort of carved out, and then the breaking water against the shore created the bluff. So these glaciers, one of the other things they did is they made a really interesting mixture of soil for us, where you have 2 different confining beds made of clay, made of rock, and in our case, there's a specific kind of clay called marl. Sounds like Carl, but with an M. And that marl is keeping aquifers of water under pressure. And of course, when water is under pressure and then you puncture it, suddenly you get Harbor Springs, artesian wells. So Harbor Springs, of course, is named after these 2 sort of prominent features. The deep natural harbor, which was a result of the glaciers carving out certain areas in our in Emmett County, and then the artesian wells, which are tapped all over Harbor Springs. So that's a little bit about our natural history, our place in the world, and how it came to be. Switching from the natural setting to the historic, to the people. And our story, of course, really begins with the history of the Anishinaabek. Anishinaabek translates to the good people or the real people, and it is a confederation of 3 different tribes in Michigan: the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa. The Odawa and Ottawa are the same, just different spellings, as is the Ojibwe and Chippewa. And so those 3 nations together form the Council of 3 Fires, and they're known as the Anishinaabek. Now, the French first encountered our local Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians people when they were on Manitoulin Island, which is right here. You can see on the map, Manitoulin Island, it's in Canada. And that was where the French, when they first started coming down into the Great Lakes area, into New France, as they called it, first encountered the Odawa people. And the Odawa had already established a huge series of different trade networks throughout the Midwest, but also throughout the entire nation. They were trading with other native tribes in the Gulf region. There were shells from the Gulf region. There's specific pipestones from out west, different items from the East Coast. So it was a very large trade network. And the French were only too happy to tap into this trade network and make use of it for the fur trade. So when they first encountered the Odawa here at Manitoulin Island, there very quickly becomes sort of a conflict and a war that's called the Beaver Wars, which you might have guessed were over beaver pelts, over the fur trade. And so the Iroquois were pushing into Odawa territory, trying to take over that lucrative fur trade. And so the Odawa were actually forced out of this area. They fled first to the Straits of Mackinac area, and then later all the way over here near Bayfield, Wisconsin. And they were there for probably only about 20 years. And by that time, they defeated the Iroquois with the help of the French and took back over their homeland. And they ended up settling back here at the Straits of Mackinac, which had become sort of the center of the fur trade in our area. So for about 70 more years, the main Odawa village is here at Michilimackinac. And Michilimackinac is the fort on the mainland, unlike Fort Mackinac. And the Odawa village was just outside of the fort. They grew corn and squash and beans and were a very important part of feeding that huge fort. And of course, part of the intermediaries of the fur trade. I'm not going to go too deep into that. We did actually just have a great lecture about voyageurs and the French fur trade that will be up on our YouTube page probably in another week or so. That was an in-person talk back in February. So to answer Susan's questions, yes, we do record some of our lectures that are in person and put them up on YouTube. But if you'd like to learn more about that, there are countless fantastic books all about the fur trade and about the complicated relationships between the Anishinaabek and the French and later the British. But coming back to our area, in about 1742, the soil was a little bit less fertile around Mackinac, and it just wasn't really a fantastic place to be anymore. And so the Odawa moved, and they moved down here to this main area of Goodhart Middle Village, and that's in about 1742. And that's sort of the beginning of sort of a more permanent settlement in the area. The Odawa did still travel seasonally, but there was a large village that basically stretched this entire coastline from Cross Village down all the way to Petoskey. And that entire area was given the name Waganakising. You can see it up here. There's various spellings for Waganakising. It is an Odawa word in the Odawa language. The Odawa language is Anishinaabe. And Waganakising means it is bent. And the story goes that a great spirit hit a great pine tree near Goodhart and Middle Village and bent it. And that bend leaned out over Lake Michigan. And anyone paddling around this coast would be able to see that tree and know that they were coming home and that they were reaching this area. Now, the French, of course, heard it is bent or bent tree and came up with the name L'arbre croche, which of course means crooked tree. And then later you have the British and the Americans who just say crooked tree. So in case you ever wondered where all of these Crooked Tree Arts Center, Crooked Tree Breadworks, where all of these names come from, it all goes back to 1742 and to the name Waganakising. Now, when the Odawa were in Michilimackinac, they encountered a missionary priest by the name of Father Dugenais. And when they moved in 1742, the priest went with them. He split his time between Fort Michilimackinac at St. Anne's Church and the new settlement in Middle Village. He developed a strong working relationship with the local Odawa, and they built a small chapel for him in Middle Village. It was later replaced by a larger one dedicated to Bishop Baraga in about the 1830s. And later, after that structure burnt down, it was replaced again, this time in 1899. And that church still stands today in Goodhart. It's called St. Ignatius Church. So if you've ever been out there, it has a very, very long history. Now, these relationships that the Odawa had created, first with the French, later with the British, and with the churches and missionaries proved extremely important. So the British take control of the area from the French in about 1760. And of course, that rule didn't last long. You have the War of 1812, which the Americans won, of course. We're sitting here today as Americans. And Americans, right after they won the War of 1812, really wanted to expand into this area of Michigan. And we could spend an entire lecture about the War of 1812 and the events that occurred afterwards. I'm doing a real broad brushstroke here, but one of the outcomes of the War of 1812 was the Indian Removal Act, which President Jackson signed in 1830. And the Indian Removal Act required that all tribes east of the Mississippi immediately move to lands west of the Mississippi. The most famous of these removals is the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but it happened all across the East Coast to many different tribal nations. And the Odawa saw what was happening to these other brother and sister tribes out east and knew that they wanted to remain home. They had to find a way to stay in Waganakesing, to stay in Little Traverse. And so they started negotiating treaties. One really important leader in the treaty movement was Augustin Hamlin Jr. You can see his picture here. He was also known as Kanapima, which means he who is talked about. And Augustin Hamlin Jr. Had been educated in Western schools. He went with his cousins to a seminary school in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he was a magnificent interpreter. He knew Odawa, he knew Latin, he knew French, he knew English. And so he was a very important interpreter while negotiating these different treaties. And I have this quote from him up on the screen just because I think it's a really eloquent summation of the aims of the local Odawa in staying in Little Traverse. And he says, "It is a heartrending thought to think of leaving our native country forever. There are many local endearments which make the soul shrink with horror at the idea of rejecting our country forever. The mortal remains of our deceased parents, relations, and friends cry out to us, as it were, for our compassion, our sympathy, and our love." So the Odawa signed a treaty with the United States. The first treaty is the Treaty of Washington in 1836. They ceded about 37% of the current state of Michigan, almost 14 million acres, in exchange for 50,000 acres at Little Traverse to call their own. I love this image here of Zorn Park in relation to what Andrew Blackbird writes about it. So Andrew Blackbird, who was born sometime after the War of 1812, he himself wasn't exactly sure when, was a small child when the Treaty of 1836 was being written, and a contingent of leaders from Odawa, from the Odawa village that is now at Little Traverse, left in a canoe from Harbor Springs and paddled all the way to Washington, D.C. And Andrew Blackbird commemorates this. He writes, "I was clear at the top of those trees with my little chums, watching our people as they were about to go off in a long bark canoe. And, as we understood, they were going to Washington to see the great father, the President of the United States, to tell him to have mercy on the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians in Michigan, and not to take all the land away from them." So if you're ever at Zorn Park in Harbor Springs, try to picture that sort of monumental moment of winter in Harbor Springs. As soon as it thaws, you're in a birch bark canoe paddling your way to Washington, D.C. So moving backward a little bit, we talked about 1830 and some of the treaties in 1836, but backing up a tiny bit, in 1829, there was sort of a split in the Odawa Nation that was at Middle Village. There was a group of more traditional Odawa and a group of sort of firmly Catholic Odawa. And the Catholic Odawa moved away from Middle Village and founded a new church with their priest, Father Pierre Dejean, right here in a place they called Wequitansing. That name probably sounds familiar. You've seen it spelled other ways. And Wequitansing means Little Bay Place or Small Bay Place, referring to Little Traverse Bay. They built a church and a school. This is Holy Childhood Church, which of course is still standing today in the exact same spot. It's been remodeled, there's been additions, but it is in the same place. And I believe parts of the original structure are still encased in the new one. We'd have to talk to someone from the Holy Childhood Church to get the full history on that. So basically the group that moved to Wequitansing, to what would later become Harbor Springs, agreed to Americanize. They were giving up their traditional beliefs, giving up a lot of their, culture in exchange for protection from removal, in exchange for schooling, for agriculture implements, other things that were promised to them in the treaties. And so this is the beginning of Harbor Springs. The first permanent settlement in Harbor Springs is 1829. Now, for a couple of decades, we remained just a small Odawa village. Those treaties I mentioned earlier, specifically the follow-up Treaty of Detroit in 1855, put a limit on the settlement of the area by anyone who was not indigenous. So in 1855, the Odawa tribe basically agreed to, instead of having one large reservation, they agreed to split the land between individual families. And sort of like homesteaders at the time, you could get a certain allotment of acreage that would then be yours. And so they had a period of 20 years after the Treaty of 1855 to do that. And so for a long time, the only presence here that was not Odawa were occasional priests and missionaries and some traders. The area became known as Little Traverse after Little Traverse Bay. The first business in Harbor Springs was a cooperage, which provided barrels for fish, because fishing was sort of the only other occupation of the area. Now, we got a post office in 1861. So that's really putting us on the map, as it were. And we were known as Little Traverse. The post office was Little Traverse, and that was 1861. Now, as I mentioned, settlement for European families, homesteaders, didn't take place until 20 years after that 1855 treaty. So it's 1875 when those lands are first opened up to settlement. And there is an absolute rush of immigration to northern Michigan. Some of the first groups that came were homesteaders. Civil War veterans in particular were offered, I believe it was 160 acres or 80 acres. It depended on how many years you served and that sort of a thing. If you would put that land under cultivation and make it into an agricultural farm. So this picture here is one of our first homesteaders, Abraham Stutzman. And Stutzman, of course, founded the area, the little small outlying community known as Stutzmanville. Other small outlying communities like 5 Mile Creek are the descendants of some of these early homesteaders in the area. You can see a picture of 5 Mile Creek here. And because at that time, these locations were, a fairly long walk or horse ride from each other, they developed into little homes, homesteads and towns of their own. They had general stores, they had schools. 5 Mile Creek ended up having a sawmill, and they could generally support themselves. But let's move back to Little Traverse again. And again, we're skimming the surface. I could do a whole lecture about 5 Mile Creek or Stutzmanville, but we're not going to. We're going to move forward in time. Now, we were Waganakising, and then La Croche, and then Wequitansing, and then Little Traverse. And finally, in 1881, we become Harbor Springs. So the name change occurred in 1881. We were officially incorporated as a city, as Harbor Springs. Not everyone was happy about the change. These are 2 newspaper articles from the Petoskey City Record talking about the change of the name. And in this clipping here in particular, it says, the Little Traverse people have by one unwise net wiped out the name around which hovers so many memories and traditions by incorporating their town with the name of Harbor Springs. It will be Little Traverse still. A rose by any other name is just as sweet. By 1887, you can see we have grown considerably from that small Odawa village. As I mentioned, there was an absolute rush of settlement here beginning in 1875. There were homesteaders, but there were also loggers. So lumbering resources in southern Michigan were beginning to disappear at this point, but the lumber boom was really still just getting started. And lumber in Michigan was the most significant natural resource for our state. In Harbor Springs in particular, at one point, 75% of our economy was tied to logging and lumbering in one way or another. And we were ideally situated to be a logging town. We were right on this deep natural harbor where schooners could come in from lumber markets in Chicago or Milwaukee or any other Great Lake port and transport that lumber out. And we had just abundant white pine, which was really sought after up here. I have to point out this picture here. This gentleman on the left holding a saw is Mitchell Wemagwas, which is my husband's great-great-grandfather, I believe. I can see him in his face. So just fun little anecdote. But logging in Harbor Springs was a big deal. There were mills all across the waterfront. This one you're seeing here is Thomas Neal's Mill, which is where the Little Harbor Club is situated today. There were other mills like the Carey Hoop Company, which later became the Harbor Springs Lumber Company. E.L. Marshall had a toothpick factory. There was the Rowe Mill. There was the Cadillac Handle Company, which made broom handles. You can see here, takes a second to load, there we go. This is a map, a 1902 plat map of Harbor Springs, and you can see all of these different docks are essentially tied to different sawmills. This is Thomas Neal's Mill right down here at the beginning of Harbor Point, and you can see the others wrapping around the harbor here. This is the Carey Hoop Factory. The Crowell Lumber Company had a big office right about here where today's Ottawa Stadium is. By 1890, so this is quite a bit later, but by 1890, sawmills in Michigan cut 4.5 billion board feet of lumber. Demand was absolutely insatiable, and Harbor Springs definitely benefited from that. So we're growing as a village. We are now officially, on the map, you could say. And during this time, we were such a boom town that we were the county seat of Emmett County. And as the population of our town grew, the demand for public schools grew as well. And so Little Traverse School District #1 was created back in the 1870s. And this is one of the first school buildings that they created. And it was up on the bluff at the back of the village where today's Harbor Springs High School is located. So the school maybe moved to the other side of the street at one point, but it's always been in this location at the top of the bluff. Here's a few other images of the school. It was added onto many times throughout the years. This right here on the right is the original school that we saw back in this picture. And you can see that they've added basically, they've doubled it and then doubled the size of the school again. Eventually, of course, even that wasn't enough and a new school was needed. The last addition to this school was made in 1905. And then in 1915, they decided, we need a big dedicated high school. And Earl Mead, a local architect, drew up the designs and created it. And the high school building that we know now on the bluff was made in 1915. The first year that that school was opened, it published a yearbook called the Orange and Black. And you can see here, these are some examples of yearbooks from our collection. We have most of the years, especially those early years before World War I, the yearbooks at the time. Now, we took a little bit of a detour there, going back in time a little bit here. As the logging boom was happening, almost simultaneously with that same rush of settlement in the 1870s, 1880s, you have the resorts beginning. One of the reasons for that is that logging companies and railroad companies had invested so much in the infrastructure needed to connect all of these different hubs of trade to each other. The railroads in particular had invested quite a bit in infrastructure. And when logging was beginning to dwindle, they decided, you know, instead of carrying freight, carrying lumber, they were going to start carrying people. And they turned into a passenger business. And in what I like to call sort of the Pure Michigan campaign of the early 19th century, they started advertising Northern Michigan. They advertised it specifically for its pure air and clean water, and claimed that the area just being here would cure you of hay fever, asthma, and all sorts of other ailments. And if that wasn't enough to entice you up here, they started targeting sports enthusiasts. They had a whole map about the different golf courses along the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. They had a similar map all about where to go fishing along the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railway. And it worked. Of course, the natural beauty of this area is unsurpassed. And it was at this time when the area was thrown open to settlement that there was a rapid sort of urbanization and industrialization in large cities. Cities were becoming crowded, polluted, dirty, noisy, just not great places to be. And Northern Michigan was a refuge from these places. So some of the resorts that we have here were founded very early on. So settlement was opened in about 1875. By 1878, you get our first two resorts, Harbor Point and Wequatansi. So Harbor Point Association was actually founded by a group of businessmen from Lansing. They came to visit Harbor Springs, Little Traverse, and they camped on Harbor Point. And they loved it. They came to hunt and to fish and to enjoy the pure air. And they loved it so much that they purchased the entire peninsula of Harbor Point and set about forming an association out of it. By 1880, just a few years later, they had hired a surveyor, a landscape architect by the name of John Swift, to lay out all of the different paths, all the different cottages, and to construct sort of an ideal environment where you had these little pockets of nature and where all the carriage paths were laid out. They also built the first clubhouse, the first hotel, and hotels at that time. Here's the Harbor Point Hotel, or the clubhouse as it was known. Hotels were extremely important because the goal of every resort association, at least in our area, was to get people to purchase shares in your association. And by the purchasing of those shares, they were entitled to lease lots in the association and build their own cottages. Well, hotels provided visitors a way to sort of try before they buy. They could come up, they could stay in the hotel, they could take in all of the sites and decide if they wanted to invest in a cottage of their own. At the same time, cottages at that time were pretty basic affairs. Even if they had numerous guest rooms and beautiful porches and just lovely living rooms, they didn't often have kitchens, not full kitchens. And so most hotels and clubhouses had elaborate dining rooms, and most meals were taken at the clubhouse. This clubhouse at first only had 50 rooms, but by 1897, it had 150. Here's another view of some of the cottages on Harbor Point. Now, the clubhouse that we just saw in the previous picture, I will mention, it was torn down in about the 1960s. Eventually, it got to the point where cottages were becoming larger. They were being remodeled. They had kitchens of their own, and there really just wasn't much point to a hotel anymore once all the lots were sold. Here's another view. This is the dock at Harbor Point. This is one of my favorite pictures. I just love the atmosphere of it. You can see all of these ships out on the harbor here. And this one in particular at the end of the dock is called the Silver Spray. It is a ferry that went just between Little Traverse Bay and the different points. And of course, we can't talk about Harbor Point without mentioning the Harbor Point Lighthouse. Very briefly, in about 1883, the fall of 1883, the United States government is realizing that they need a lighthouse at Harbor Point to keep ships from running aground, basically, into that peninsula. So they purchase, the US government purchases about 3.5 acres at the end of Harbor Point from the association, because the association was founded previous to this. And in 1884, they landed materials at the site, and in 96 days, just 96 days, they built the Little Traverse Lighthouse. Now, the first keeper of Little Traverse Lighthouse was Elizabeth Whitney Williams. She's a remarkable figure. We just had a lecture a few weeks ago about lighthouse keepers in northern Michigan, in Michigan in general, so I won't wax on too much about her. But she was here for 29 years and kept the lighthouse. And because this was a lighthouse in the, in a resort association, in addition to all of her duties, keeping the light burning, running a lighthouse, running a life-saving station, she had to give tours of the lighthouse to all of the interested resorters and visitors who came up. The Harbor Point Association has her original log books where she kept track of the different visitors to the lighthouse. The lighthouse was an active station for 79 years. It was decommissioned in 1963, and the lighthouse itself was sold back to the Harbor Point Association, who maintain it. They've done a brilliant job preserving and maintaining that lighthouse. So moving back on, I said 2 resorts were founded in 1878, Harbor Point and this one, Weequatonting. Now, the name Weequatonting should sound familiar. That was the first name of our town from 1829, meaning Little Bay Place. And originally, in order to encourage this type of development and settlement, Harbor Springs actually gave 80 acres to a local, well, not local, they were from the Flint area of Michigan, Kalamazoo. They gave that 80 acres to the Presbyterian Summer Resort Association. The Presbyterian Summer Resort Association, in another 2 or 3 years, renamed themselves. They never had extremely strong ties specifically to the Presbyterian Church. There were many ministers, Presbyterian ministers who were part of the early board of trustees and who managed some of the resort, but it was never like Bayview across the way. Bayview and Petoskey really was a Methodist retreat. So Weequatonting, again, founded in 1878. It was known for its birches, the birch trees in particular. You can see right here, that's some of the main, a lot of the imagery you see in Weequatonting has to do with the birch trees. And they had a hotel, of course. They built a hotel in about 1878. As soon as the resort was up and running, they knew they needed a hotel, again, so people could come up and visit and decide to purchase shares in their corporation. The hotel quickly needed to be expanded. In 1881, Charles Caskey, who is a local builder, he actually built our building here that we're in, the History Museum. He expanded the hotel. You can see this is a newspaper clipping actually talking about Mr. Caskey's improvements on the hotel, which included a new dining room. And there would be 25 to 30 new sleeping rooms as well. The hotel was completely rebuilt in 1900 in order to accommodate even more people. It eventually is 3 stories tall. Here are some images, some cottages in Wekwatanse. And as the association and the hotel and every part of Wekwatanse expanded, there were 2 annexes that developed, East and West Wekwatanse, which handled sort of the growing number of visitors and people who wanted to take part. Here's the dock at Wekwatanse. You can see its name right there, and the hotel would have been right here. You can see it through the trees a little bit. That's the Wekwatanse Hotel. Now, of the resorts, Harbor Point, Wekwatanse, and Roaring Brook are sort of the big 3. Roaring Brook was founded by another group of businessmen from Lansing, just like Harbor Point was. They created the Roaring Brook Association in about 1880. The land was originally purchased by a gentleman named William Crosby, and they, of course, did the same things as some of the other resorts. They immediately built and carved some of these beautiful meandering walkways into the hillsides. They built a hotel, and the hotel you can see here, the Roaring Brook Inn, was expanded and renovated several times. This, of course, is the most famous postcard of Roaring Brook. If you Google Roaring Brook, this is what you'll get, an image of the Roaring Brook itself. Here's a few pictures from the inside of the Roaring Brook Inn. This is the porch here, and this is the main dining room. Now, unfortunately, the Roaring Brook Inn burned down in 1956 and was never rebuilt. At that time, Fred Ranker had just taken over management of the hotel, ownership of the hotel. He'd done something like $50,000 worth of renovations, and the very next winter, it burned down. And here's that famous picture of the Roaring Brook itself. Again, I love these 2. They look so serious up there on that log. All right, just a little bit more about how people got here. I'm saying there's this rush of settlement. There's all these resorters coming up. Well, how they got here was 2 ways, primarily. One was the railroads, which we talked about, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad in particular, advertising the different virtues of the North. The other were these steamship companies here, like the Manitou Steamship Company. And you could get an overnight ticket from Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee. Chicago in particular took 24 hours and would cost you about $5 to get from Chicago direct to Harbor Springs. They would come directly into port. The Manitou and the Northland are just 2 names of some of the ships that would come in. You can see both of them in this lovely image. This is one of the main city docks in downtown Harbor Springs. This is the Manitou on one side of the dock, and behind it, steaming in, is the Northland. And these passenger ships, the Manitou was built in about 1893. It could carry 300 to 400 passengers at a time, and was coming several times a week to Harbor Springs to deposit passengers. The Northland was built a couple of years later. She could carry 450 passengers and had a crew of about 185. So these were big, big boats that were able to come to Harbor Springs and dock here because of our naturally deep harbor. These are a few items in our permanent collection from the steamship Manitou. One is this wonderful little cup. And then this is a baggage manifest, which I love because it's showing you the different names of people, or the different, not their names, but just where they're coming from. So Chicago to Harbor Springs, Milwaukee to Harbor Springs, Chicago again, and descriptions. There's a trunk, there's a bike, there's another trunk. I think this one says bundle. So it's just sort of fascinating to see. And this is from 1897, this baggage manifest. Now, once they were here, the easiest way to get around was again either on the railroad or on the harbor. Remember, at this point, you don't have automobiles, and the roads between here and Petoskey were not particularly well graded, and your horse and carriage going over those roads would have been a bit like a roller coaster. So the most popular option was a ferry. The ferry system at the time was massive. This is just a couple of the different ferries. The Adrian, you can see here, we saw the Silver Spray in an earlier image. The first ferry line got started right as everyone was coming here in 1875. That 1875 is kind of a, I don't know, a boom year for Harbor Springs. And Christopher Chrysler was the first one. You can see his name down here, Christopher P. Chrysler. He purchased a steam ferry called the Geo Wool and began his ferry line. And eventually he was joined by his son, who helped run the business, eventually took over the business, and the company ran through the 19-teens into the 1920s before the rise of the automobile sort of took out the ferry business. Now, the thing I find fascinating about the ferry business, the ferries only went around the harbor. So they would go from Harbor Point to Harbor Springs to Wequitansing to Roaring Brook to Bayview to Petoskey. So they'd go all the way around the bay, but that's all the further they went. They never went out into Lake Michigan, of course. And there were as many as 5,000 people a day on those ferries. The ferries left every 25 minutes from the various docks. And I just find that fascinating. You could also take round trip tickets. You could go one way on the ferry and come back on the train. The tickets were interchangeable. Now I'll see if I can get this to play. This is a lovely video from the 1930s, 1929, of the last ferry called the America coming into the Harbor Point dock. This video was provided for us by Leroy Kramer. And the America really was the last ferry operating in the area. And after that point, it was pretty much all automobile traffic. So let's see, where am I at? 7:45. I'm going to give you 3 more slides, I think, and then we're going to call it so that you have time to ask questions down in the chat. If you have any, I'm happy to speak to anything you're interested in hearing more about. I did want to show you just a few more slides to do with the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. It was such an important force in getting people to Harbor Springs. The line reached Petoskey in about 1873 or so, and it didn't expand all the way to Harbor Springs and Mackinac City until 1882. But it came to Harbor Springs in 1882, and let me see if I have the picture. I do have a picture. I'm going to go back to my very first slide because it shows you right here on the left the depot. So this is the depot for the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. It's the depot that currently still exists today. It was built in 1899. And we know that this picture is from 1899 because this in the background is the Kensington Hotel. The Kensington Hotel was the only four-story structure in Harbor Springs for a very long time, and it burned down at the end of 1899. So that's how we can situate this picture roughly in summer of 1899. That's when the Grand Rapids and Indiana Depot was constructed. You can see here an image of the rail lines coming up through Petoskey to Bayview, Kagomek, and then around the way to Roaring Brook and Wequitansing. They split right there near Bayview, and the railway went up and around towards Mackinac City. Here's an image of that depot, again, built in 1889. And you might have heard the phrase dummy trains. And that, from what I can understand, it refers to the fact that the railroad, the cars would come into Harbor Springs, but there was no turnaround. no way for them to turn, like physically turn around the engine. And so it would have to go backwards, back into Petoskey. And they called it a dummy train because of that. So to recap, we have covered 1742 through about 1910. Harbor Springs has gone from a small Odawa village and missionary outpost to a logging and fishing town, to a logging boom town. We've had these neighboring communities like Stutzmanville and 5 Mile Creek blossom. We had a boom in the resort and tourism industry at the same time. Our resorts, Wequitansing, Harbor Point, and Roaring Brook were founded. And we are just thriving as we are moving into the wars, the years before World War I. And unfortunately, that is where I'm going to stop. If you'd like to hear about World War I through about 1960, you will have to come to the second lecture, unfortunately. All right, so that is my scheduled program. I wish I could do a deeper dive into some of these topics, but this was really about just giving you a baseline of Harbor Springs history, knowing where we came from. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to answer them. Questions either about the history of Harbor Springs or about the Historical Society and what we're up to. I'm happy to answer those types of questions as well. Let's see, and I'm going to put back on the screen just so you all can see it. A quick reminder that we have our next talk in person at the museum on April 27th with Naomi Singer talking about the scenic M119 Tunnel of Trees, and part 2 of this presentation on May 11th at 7 o'clock via Zoom. So if you want to learn more about World War I, the influenza pandemic of 1918, hopefully you will sign up and come back for that. Let's see. Thank you all so much for your kind words. I'm not seeing any questions. I'm mostly just seeing thank yous, which thank you for being interested in the Historical Society's programming, in our history. I'm always astounded by how such a small place can have such a deep heritage. I think the history here is so incredibly rich, and we are excited to be exploring it in all of our different lectures and exhibits here at the museum. And thank you so much for your patronage. We really do appreciate it. We do have a question coming in. How many people lived in Harbor Springs in 1910? Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I would have to look. I honestly think that our population was probably similar to the number of year-round residents that we have today. But in order for there to be 5,000 people a day on the ferries, I think that the population, especially in the summer, must have been much, much higher. So it sort of depends on what time of year you're asking about for our population. People think it gets busy now in the summer, but it really was quite, it must have been quite something back in the day. Let's see, last photo of the logging train in the mill. Do you know what mill that was? Let me go back. Oh, I do, yes. So this is the Crowl Mill, which is C-R-O-W-L. It is right where sort of the Harbor Springs Deer Park is right now. And so this hill that you can kind of see on the right of the picture is East Hill, right as you're coming down into town. Ottawa Stadium would be somewhere over here. You can see down at the base of this mill is what they call a log pond, where they roll all of the logs to get off bark and dirt and that kind of thing before it is pulled up on this ramp into the sawmill itself. And you can see all of the finished lumber stacked up here, waiting to go to a lumber schooner. Was Harbor Springs bigger than Petoskey? I don't believe that we were ever bigger than Petoskey, actually. We were always sort of the little cousin, which is probably why in 1902, the county seat moved to Petoskey. We didn't get the honor of being the county seat for terribly long. Let's see. And I think that's it. If you have more questions, if you have comments or anything like that, please feel free to email me or get in touch with the Historical Society. We would love to hear from you. Oh, let me see something real quick though. There's a TV series called American Built about the Grand Hotel. Yes. Now the Grand Hotel, super quick note, was built by Charles Caskey, who I talked about building the Wequitansing Hotel. He also built the Emmett County Courthouse, which is now Harbor Springs History Museum that I'm currently in. And he built our building in 1886. He built the Grand Hotel in 1887. So Caskey was a well-known builder in our area, not just of sort of commercial buildings, but also many, many cottages. All right. I think that that is it. Thank you all again so much for coming to this talk and for being a part of the Historical Society's programming. We hope to see you at part 2 and look for a recording of this lecture probably within the next day or 2. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.